What I'd like to talk about is why we need to keep working at these things that you heard all the panels about today. The financial crisis was the latest example of just how interdependent our world is. Yes, it started in America, and yes, the United States made a lot of mistakes in this decade, concentrating too much of our investment in housing, all the growth coming from housing, finance, and consumer spending, netting nearly no jobs and no income increases, and a tremendous acceleration of income inequality, which has parenthetically been accelerating in every year since 1973, when we were fully into a global financial and economic system, except, you have to give me one little bragging right here, in the 4 years of my second term, when inequality went down, because of a combination of extraordinary job growth, over 90% of which was in the private sector, which tightened the labor markets, and strong support for working families at the lower end of the scales, which lifted their net income, tax, and other policies. But we have a world that is interdependent, and so when America got in trouble financially, everybody else started looking around, and it turned out that the British banks and the Irish financial institutions were more real estate dependent than we were, more heavily leveraged than we were, and in deep trouble. Then it turned out that pension funds and municipal employees in small English towns were broke because of even greater leverage of a financial institution in Iceland, which had recruited their investments, which surprised a lot of people, including yours truly, because Iceland is arguably the most fertile ground for entrepreneurs in all of Europe. They had the highest percentage of self-made millionaires of any country in Europe, and in companies that did not go broke and that performed good, useful production of services and goods. So now it's happened everywhere. And China has approximately 30 million unemployed factory workers because we can't buy so many of their exports. So they were sitting on $2 trillion in cash. They had no financial crisis, but they were all dressed up with no place to go. So they're trying to do something that potentially has much longer ramifications for the global economy than has generally been thought. They are spending $600 million of their $2 trillion in cash on a stimulus program, which as a percentage of their GDP is considerably bigger than the $800 billion we're spending. And they're also trying to persuade their people to consume more. They have a personal savings rate of 45%. Were they to reduce it to 25%, it will still be the highest of any significant economy in the world, and they could finance, if you will, their own recovery, which for the Chinese people I think would be quite good, but it would have real implications for us and put even more heat on us as we recover to stop these years and years and years of deficit spending, because we'd have to have our own personal savings, we'd have to do some more of our own manufacturing, we'd have to have a whole different take on what's going to happen if the Chinese experiment fully succeeds, because they're moving from a totally export-dominated market to one which is more balanced. It remains to be seen whether even that communist country can persuade their frugal people in the midst of uncertainty to spend more. I'll tell you an interesting figure. America went to a negative savings rate last year, and this year, when the president and the economic team and the Congress, everybody's trying to encourage us to spend, we have almost a 3% personal savings rate for the first time in many, many years. So the individual and family virtue is conflicting with short-term national interest. But I think it shows you a little bit about what was inherently unstable or unsustainable about the old economic model, and why I believe when the world comes out of this, the United States and many other countries will be on sounder footing than they were before the crisis occurred, if we do it right. But to get back to the point I was making, the financial crisis shows our interdependence and makes a very important point about it. It can be good or bad or both. And so far, since America went off the gold standard and we began to move toward the most interdependent time the world has ever known, it has been both. It's obviously been good for most of us, or we wouldn't be here today. I can look out in this crowd and see that a lot of you were born somewhere else. And this is a much more interesting crowd than it would have been at a John Carroll weekend 30 years ago, where most people would have looked too much like me, old gray-haired white guys in suits. So interdependence has been good for us, and it's self-evident to most of us what is good about it. But the world is suffering from a persistent set of problems: inequality, instability, and unsustainability. Income inequality, inequality in access to employment, healthcare, and education. It's unstable because of terrorism, narco trafficking, organized crime, and because of the way the financing works, as we all just seen. And it's unsustainable because of global warming. So it's obvious, to me at least, that all of us should think about what we do in our work lives, what we support in government policy, and what we do with our charitable contributions or our work with non-governmental groups, about what we can do to build up the positive forces of interdependence and reduce the negative ones, to move toward a world that enables us to have shared responsibilities and shared opportunities and shared benefits. One in which we recognize our extremely interesting and important differences, but we believe that our common humanity matters more. In that context, I believe that this development work is really important, and I believe that there is a fundamentally significant role to be played by those of us who are not in government. And sometimes we can do more with less money and much less time at very high quality than if the government were doing it, through no fault of governments, but just because of the inherent constraints of public institutions.